Transportation Committee for June 10th, 2019. First order of business is approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda? Not, I entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And the agenda is approved. Next is approval of the minutes from the May 13, 2019 meeting. Did anyone have any changes or additions to the minutes? Not, I entertain a motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
Motion is a second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And the minutes are approved. Next, we're on to reports. First, we have MTS Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, members, a couple updates tonight. First, kind of an outcome of the spring Metro Mobility convening. We heard there was quite a bit of discussion there about the ways we could talk about some of the positives that we hear from customers about Metro Mobility service. Often you may hear some of the negatives. They might reach out to you, and some of the customers there just wanted to make sure that policymakers understood that they really appreciate the service. So tonight I brought along a few thank yous that have been received since then. Thought just to share with you as an example of many that we get, and so you see some positive stories. So in your time tonight, you can maybe look at some of those. But the customers thought that was important that you also heard some of the positives too. So I thought that was a good idea to share with you. We're continuing with the chairs and council member visits to stakeholders. Tomorrow is a visit to the Dakota County Board, and looking at some of the items that they wanted to talk about. A lot of those are transportation related topics, including how transitways are funded and county shares. Dakota County is a partial funder of the Orange Line and has been a funder of Red Line, so that's one of the topics. They wanted to impress upon the council that they have a request in to upgrade one of their roads to a principal arterial roadway. And we just received that request last week, but they're going to press upon the importance of that. And they also will again be discussing some of the importance of regional trail funding. They've raised some concerns about some of the differences between a regional bicycle transportation network trail and a regional recreational trail. And they've raised that concern in the past, but those are some topics they're going to bring up related to transportation tomorrow. In addition to talk about some of the positive things happening in Dakota County, of course. One of the legislative outcomes was that we would be expanding our Metro Mobility service to Lakeville, and just want to let you know that planning is underway for that. Hopefully we would like to start that service around 1st of January of next year. And we have some items that will start to come through this committee in the next few meetings regarding amendments to the existing service contract, purchase of fleet, and some other changes that need to be made. But it does look like we are able to meet that schedule. The legislature kind of wanted us to get us going as soon as possible after January 1st. And so that is on track, and we'll be starting to communicate with Lakeville residents. City has agreed to partner with us using some of their communication methods to let their citizens know about this new service expansion. With that, Madam Chair, that concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you tell me what the criteria is for adding a city to Metro Mobility? I think there were other cities that were also.
Madam Chair, Council Member, we are prescribed. The state law prescribes where our boundaries are, and in 2006 they said Metro Mobility must be this level of the transit taxing district. And since that time, 5 cities have added to the transit taxing district, but the way they wrote that law, the boundary did not change from 2006. But this most recent session, they expanded that to include Lakeville, because they are one of the cities that joined since 2006. There are 4 other cities, Maple Plain, Columbus, Forest Lake, and City of Ramsey, that are in the transit taxing district, but not by state statute part of the Metro Mobility boundary. So those 4 cities, at one point they were in the legislation, and in the final bill it was just Lakeville in it. So I expect that in the future that maybe not be under consideration, but unless that state law changes, that boundary is pretty fixed. Or if our fixed route transit expands to a new city that is outside that boundary, we are required by federal law to bring our service along the fixed route. But generally our fixed route transit is within those boundaries. So, and hopefully when we do expand, they bring money with it too, but they didn't this time. So that's what guides it.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions for Director Thompson? All right, that will go to COO Pellegrin from Metro
Thank-
Transit. Thank you.
Madam Chair and council members, thank you. My name is Vince Pellegrin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Metro Transit. I'm here tonight pinch hitting for General Manager Koistra. We want to thank everyone for joining us Saturday to celebrate the opening of our newest BRT service, the Metro C line. The first few days of service have been tremendously successful with lots of excitement from the community and riders and staff. Staff have been riding throughout the weekend to help customers get familiar with the new service, and we'll be back out on C-Line stations tomorrow as we transition to revenue service. I was out there on Saturday, and the weather was beautiful. We had prepared long and hard. The buses work very well. Charging systems working. Buses are very quiet, and there's no tailpipe on those buses. Pretty amazing, huh? I want to make you aware of our ovations meeting. We recognize some of our safest and most reliable bus and train operators at our ovations brunch later this month. The annual event recognizes operators who have reached career milestones like 20, 25, and 30 consecutive years of safe driving. Among this year's honorees is an operator who has gone a remarkable 40-year safe driving record. Operators will also be recognized for strong attendance and customer service records. Council members are welcome and encouraged to attend. The event will be held Wednesday, June 26th at the Minneapolis Marriott Northwest, 7025 Northland Drive. A program will begin at 10 a.m. Transportation to the event will be provided to and from each of our 5 garages. Rail anniversaries. June 26th also marks a milestone for one of our light rail lines, the Metro Blue Line's 15th anniversary. Back in those days when it first opened, it was called the Hiawatha Line. Brian Funk and I were talking earlier about those days where we only had 1-car trains out there. Today, as you well know, we have 3-car trains. So, and we've extended platforms, made lots of improvements. We actually ran some doubles in those days. We only had a fleet of 27 cars, but we've come a long ways. This Friday, June 14th, marks the Green Line's 5th anniversary. The North Star Commuter Rail Line will reach its 10th anniversary in November. Combined, these rail lines have been ridden more than 216 million times since their respective openings. Rail repairs. With age comes a need for maintenance. Early this morning, we wrapped up a 10-day effort to replace thousands of feet of worn rail, several pieces of equipment that allow trains to switch tracks, the switches, we call them interlockings, particularly at the Mall of America, which has been very problematic for us for the last year or so, that really needed replacement. And so we proceeded with that to get that kind of work done. Throughout the construction, replacement buses were used to provide uninterrupted service to our customers. Transit police reminder. Transit police chief interviews will be held Thursday, June 13th at the Minneapolis Central Library. The event begins at 7 p.m. Questions are being solicited in advance. Our newest group of new officers will be sworn in Thursday, June 20th. The ceremony will begin at 1:30 p.m. at the Town and Country Club on Mississippi River Boulevard. Transit police will move into their new headquarters on Monday, June 24th. Parts of the building will also be open to all employees. We'll have open house for the public on 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Saturday, July 20th. That concludes my report.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Pellegrin? Oh, if not, just a couple of quick comments. I want to thank all the council members who did come out for the Sea Line opening this weekend. It was a great day. Very, very big thank you and shout out to our staff who did an exceptional job, not just in developing the line and the work along there, but even in hosting the event. So it was a super proud day for all of us. As you know, I always like to hype the events that I like going to, and Mr. Pellegrin highlighted 2 of them. One is the Ovations event, and the other is the swearing-in ceremony for the new officers. Both are very great events. If you have the flexibility, try and make it to one or both. So, all right, within that, we can move on to the rest of our agenda. The next thing is the consent items. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second?
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. And the consent agenda is passed. And next, we're on to non-consent items. The first item is 2019-143, which is Transit Link Scott and Carver Intergovernmental Agreement. We have Sheila Williams and John Harper. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm John Harper, and I'm the manager of contracted transit service in MTS. And I'm here with Sheila Williams, who is our senior project administrator in charge of our Transit Link programs. Sheila is going to present our business item to you today, and we will both be here then to stand for any questions you have around the business item.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. As John mentioned, I oversee the council's Transit Link program. And I'd like to give you a little bit of background about Transit Link. One of the things I wanted to point out is that, as we all know, the fixed route system, both bus and rail, is the backbone of our region's transportation system. Fixed route service is most available in the dense core of our region and is unavailable in the suburban and ex-urban portions of our region. Transit Link, of course, is the council's general public dial-a-ride service provided in portions of the region where fixed route service is not provided. The service is open to the general public, and eligibility is solely based on fixed route availability. Every trip request is screened for a fixed route solution. The trip is eligible for Transit Link only if a fixed route solution is not available within the seasonal walking distance of a half mile or quarter of a mile. Customers may also be directed to a fixed route for a portion of their trip with connections made at transit centers throughout the region. MTS provides Transit Link in its 5 service areas by procuring multi-year operating agreements and directly with private vendors or allowing counties to manage the service in their jurisdiction. And in this case of Scott County, the county has chosen to directly procure and manage Transit Link dial-a-ride services in Scott and Carver counties, with the council funding the service and providing oversight to the county through an interagency agreement. The action before you today is to authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute an intergovernmental agreement with Scott County for Transit Link dial-a-ride services in Scott and Carver counties from July 1st, 2019 through January 31st of 2024 in an amount not to exceed $8,445,862. And with that said, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from council members? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the action.
So moved.
Motion.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And the business item is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we are on to business item 2019-124. It's consideration of anticipated surplus property for disposition. We have Claudius Toussaint.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and council members. This business item is to request that the county declare 3 parcels of land as surplus and to authorize the disposition of these parcels. 1 second. The first parcel, Parcel 1, is a remnant portion of the Vadnais Heights Park and Ride. The Metro Transit purchased 2.6 acres of land for the construction of a surface park and ride in Vadnais Heights. However, the city has reserved areas south of Walmart for development and has requested that the council dispose of that parcel for for development. Metro Transit staff has concluded that the existing parking spaces provide sufficient capacity for any potential future improvements, and the property is no longer needed for transit purposes. Parcel 2, north of the park and ride, also for the park and ride, is part of a 1.8 acre parcel. However, that parcel was and continues to be subject to a northwesterly access easement in favor of Spur Credit Union. The credit union has requested that the council considers conveying to them the fee simple ownership of that parcel. Metro Transit staff has concluded that that access area is not needed or useful for transit purposes because of that access easement. The third parcel, located at the intersection of Highway 52 and 110 in Invergrove Heights, is a 1.69 acre property that was purchased for the construction of a transit center. But with the establishment of LRT along Hiawatha and the construction of 2 park and rides at Fort Snelling, transit facilities at West St. Paul has declined as the ridership has shifted to Fort Snelling. As a result, transit staff believe that the transit center is no longer warranted or likely to be viable in the foreseeable future. With this, Madam Chair, council members, I stand for any questions.
Any questions from council members? Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, I think it's nice when we're efficient with the use of our land, and when there's an opportunity to, reuse the land for another purpose. That's great. It says for the funding, the proceeds may be utilized for bus and/or rail capital projects. Is there an idea for those projects yet, or does that happen at a later time in the funding section?
Madam Chair, council members, that decision will be made at a later time with consultation with our finance office and also with the approval of FTA.
Any other questions from council members? Councilmember Ferguson.
When we're thinking about selling parcels of land like this, can we think about how we might use it to spur, whether it's economic development or some of our equity goals, encouraging, let's say, minority-owned business to move into the area or find a way to, whether it's housing projects or other things, or do we just put it on the market, the highest bidder, if they want to use it for a storage facility, they get to buy it and put it in a storage facility?
Yeah. Metro Transit internal process is first to have our TOD office, our planning office, and our service development office take a look at any remnant parcels to determine whether or not there is a transit purpose for it. If they've determined that there isn't a transit purpose, then we may make decide to consider selling that property. And in those 3 instances, those 3 offices that I mentioned have determined that there is no future transit purpose for those 3 parcels. And also the businesses, adjacent businesses, have requested the sale of those parcels, and so we've decided to put them on the market.
So they want them just to expand their parking lots, or I guess it just comes back to sort of, we talked about this with another sales. How do we think about leveraging some of the land that we have to maybe think more creatively around using that land, or is there a way, as we're going to market with this, we can think about that so that we can use it to encourage some different kind of economic activity than, say, helping Walmart expand?
Parcel 2 is not helping Walmart expand. But when we considered, for example, Parcel 1, um, the construction plan was to first build a surface parking lot with the option in the future, if ridership permits, to then build a structural parking lot. The parcel that Parcel 1 is not within the footprint of that future, if there is a future parking structure. Also, during the review and process for constructing that parking lot, the city did not make it part of a resolution, but requested that we did not construct on that parcel. That was done during the review process, the development and review process. And so we constructed 294 parking spaces, which, as I mentioned, is more than sufficient for our needs. And we reserved that parking space and did not dispose of it in the 3 years that we own it, to assess ridership. And as of now, our Service Development Planning Office has determined that the increase in ridership will not warrant the need for that parcel. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is because the HOV lane on 35E has taken away some of the ridership. And the zoning, land zoning, there's a lot of wetland in Lionel Lakes. So the city does not see future development, a lot of future development in that area.
Go ahead.
Madam Chair and Councilmember, maybe I can help out a little bit here. I think what Mr. Toussaint is trying to say is that this property was purchased with the original project. We didn't need it at the end of the day. And typically, if there was a transit need for it, that'd be number one. Secondly, we've had the Transorient Development Office take a look at it as well from the standpoint of what you're talking about. But for council policy, I think we're restricted. We can't, unless we have a transit use for it or some kind of transit purpose to assign to the property, we can't make it eligible for certain business uses and not others. So per council policy, we're putting it out here as surplus property that then would be available for purchase by anybody. And that's pretty standard per the procedures that we have to work with today.
Sorry.
I say, one moment, Director Thompson has a comment too about TOD and some of our upcoming discussions on that.
Madam Chair, members, thank you. I think early in your term, we had another property that came up in some of these similar questions. And so we wanted to bring that policy discussion back to the full council. And I believe it's at a committee of the whole or an upcoming council meeting where we'll go through the TOD policy and talk about some of the current restrictions and then see if there's areas you guys, the council would like to explore differences in that. So I think similar questions that prompted us to want to bring that back to the full council. And I believe that is scheduled for an upcoming council session soon.
So I guess, is there a rush to put these on the market, or can we wait?
Madam Chair and Councilmember, and if I didn't introduce myself, Pat Jones, Assistant Director for Engineering and Facilities, Metro Transit. We could wait. These parcels have been sitting around for a while. The only thing that might constrain us at this point is we have some appraisals that Mr. Toussaint, I'm not sure if you know the dates, but our appraisals are a certain age and they would have to be renewed at some point. But otherwise, we could probably wait. Do you have any sense on that?
The appraisals, they would have to be revised if they are more than 6 months old. And they're about a month shy of that right now.
So I would recommend that we probably take action on this today, given the timing of having to renew the proposals, appraisals. Thank you, the word just disappeared. Um, But obviously, we're going to have that discussion about TOD and what we do with some of the parcels that we have. And we do have a good inventory of what we have, and so you'll get a little more history on some of that as well. So if that helps at all. Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, I'm not sure my question was quite understood. I wasn't really, I mean, he was talking about, the reuse of the land or, waiting for a decision, but my question was more on the proceeds of the sale once the sale happens. And it says they must be used for FTA grant eligible capital projects. Is that going to be part of the later discussion or?
That is a different issue, Director
Okay.
Thompson.
Madam Chair, members, that would come through the capital budget discussion. I
Okay.
believe that was, so that would be capital budget, our funds would be created through the sale. And then we bring the capital budget through the Transportation Committee and the council. And that has a whole series of projects within that. And then we can talk about how the sale and where those investments will go over the next 6 years. And that we do that every year. So there's a 6-year capital budget that'll start to come through committees this summer and be adopted later this fall. And so that essentially the sale creates more capital that can be invested, and then where that gets invested gets documented in the capital budget process.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Cummings.
I think, following up on what Councilmember Ferguson said too, I'm not sure what the cost is to update an appraisal, but if it is not a significant burden, it seems to me if we're looking at potentially changing a council policy, once the land is sold, it's gone. It's out of our hands forever. And if we're looking at something where we may change a council policy, and we're buying ourselves 6 months or however long the appraisal, I think that's what you said last, and it's not overly expensive, it might be wise to hold off on doing this and seeing if there is some way that land can be incorporated into other goals that the council has.
That would have been my exact same comment.
So, council members, how do you want to proceed? Councilmember Fredson.
What is the cost of an appraisal?
Depends on the value. Somewhere about council member $2,000 to $5,000.
And a follow-up? And this would be
Councilmember?
3 separate appraisals, correct?
Would assume so.
Yes, they would be separate.
I would move to table this conversation till after we have a review of the overall policy.
There's a motion to table. Is there a second?
Second?
Any other discussion? Councilmember Chambliss.
I did not hear the last part of his motion. Can you please repeat it?
He made a motion to table this to a future meeting.
To a future meeting, that's what it, okay, thank you.
Councilmember Fredson.
Are we at a discussion phase?
We're at a
Okay.
discussion phase.
So I'm not inclined to support the motion just because I feel like, $10,000 to $15,000 isn't a ton of money, but it is resources at play here, and I'm comfortable just looking at the 3 different parcels we're looking at, supporting the approval of the staff recommendation today. So I'll be voting no.
Any other discussion? Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, I just think that the process for the prior use and potential use has already been considered. There's a lot of options for what we could be doing with the money in a future capital budget discussion, and we'd have a lot of flexibility in how that money could be used. And there's also an impact to the local cities around these parcels and what opportunities that the availability of this land might bring, as well as developers. So I would support the proposed item.
So we're discussing currently the motion to table. So you're supporting the business item, not tabling?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just want to clarify. All right, is there any other discussion about the motion to table? Councilmember Cummings?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to remind that the last parcel that was sold, the one that we were having this discussion about originally, we did sell for less than the appraised value. So that to me is, as we're looking at moving forward and getting rid of property that we own, let's keep that in mind too. And obviously the goal is to maximize, and I'm sure that everybody is on the same page as far as that goes. But that's another concern to be aware of in my argument to table it. But
All right, any other discussion regarding the motion to table? Councilmember Gonzalez?
Thank you. I definitely agree with Councilmember Ferguson's about the need to review the way in which the disposition of property is handling. But looking at the specific properties and the description of their size and their locations, it's hard for me to see whether any other businesses might make use of those beyond what was indicated here as to there's one with an easement. I mean, that's going to limit a lot of the use of that particular property. In this instance, my inclination would be to support the disposition of the properties simply because of the specific characteristics of the properties. But I definitely agree that we need to review the way in which we handle the disposition of surplus items in order to make sure that they agree with some of our other goals, especially on the equity area.
Thank you. Any other discussion about the motion to table the business item? If not, I'll call a vote on tabling the business item. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Nay. All right, the motion does not pass. With that, we would move on to a motion to approve the business item. Okay, entertain a motion.
So moved.
Motion and a second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
No.
Business item passes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Director Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just looking ahead at the schedule, it's actually scheduled for June 19th, Committee of the Whole, TOD policy and limitations on options, discussion. So it's imminent, that discussion.
And if I can,
June 19th, Committee of the Whole.
if possible, could we get some information ahead of time about the real estate practices so everyone is aware of how we handle that? And I think that would be helpful to the discussion. Thank you. Now, next we are on to several business items for the Orange Line. Items, we've got 2019-112, 140, and 141. And we have Charles Carlson and Jim Hart. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Charles Carlson, Director of BRT Projects. Brief update for you today before presenting these two items here along with Jim. I am filling in for Christina Morrison, the project manager for the Orange Line, who's off today. Just as a reminder, if you haven't familiarized yourselves yet or gone on one of our tours, the Orange Line corridor runs from downtown Minneapolis to Burnsville. It's our busiest express bus corridor today and would be even busier with the Orange Line. So the Orange Line would be cultivating a new station-to-station market in this primarily express bus corridor today. The project budget is coming together. We have funds secured or allocated by the federal government that complete the $150 million project budget. We have nothing official yet from the FTA, but we're encouraged by signs toward a grant that will be issued soon for congressional notification. But this does cap off a fairly long road to a small starts grant that began in 2014. When we entered the program, we've completed the project work as well as FTA reviews of the project over the last several years, where finally last November, the FTA announced that they'd be allocating funds for a project, which begins what's been a very long process, again, of securing those funds into an actual grant. So we're hopeful for news very soon for toward the execution of that grant by the USDOT following a 10-day congressional notification period. So anticipating that any day. That brings us toward where we'll be. So we have proceeded with the project under special federal permission under a letter of what's called a letter of no prejudice that allowed us to move forward in partnership with MnDOT, thanks in part to local support for the project. This summer we may be 75% under contract value with one of the items before you today, and then we'll be bringing forward another package more related to the stations of the project later on. And the pictures that accompany this are of a new bidirectional transit ramp directly in and out of downtown Minneapolis on the bottom, and construction progress at the Lake Street 35W station on the top. So I'll turn it over to Jim to talk about the Knox Avenue Transitway.
Thanks, Charles. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Council members. Jim Harwood with Engineering Facilities, Metro Transit. As the previous slide noted, we received bids on May 2nd for the Knox Avenue Transitway contract of the Orange Line. Two images here on this slide showing that transitway under 494, one facing northwest towards Best Buy looking into Richfield, the other one from that same area looking south across 494 into Bloomington. You'll see a bus-only transitway under 494 that is just west of the 35W 494 interchange. We've been working cooperatively with MnDOT for several years now, ensuring that the design and ultimately construction here will accommodate their future interchange design that is currently funded in the early phases of design there as well. And the business item today, 2019-112, is related to that construction contract for that underpass and utility roadway work, excavation, and the like. Issued our invitation for bids in late March, received 5 bids on May 2nd. The lowest of those bids was from C.S. McCrossin in the amount here of $24.5 million, just under that, $24,426,017. Staff has reviewed those bids and determined the low bid is responsive and responsible. Procurement staff have made that determination. McCrossin has committed to a 17% utilization of DBE contractors, exceeding the 15% goal placed on the contract. And as Charles mentioned, the Small Starts Grant is, we believe, soon coming, and this contract execution will follow that and be contingent upon execution of that grant. So with that, the action of this business item is that the council authorize award and execution of the construction contract with C.S. McCrossin in the amount of $24,426,017.51. It's a long number. Contingent upon execution of the Small Starts Grant Agreement. And with that, we can take any questions on this business item prior to moving through the rest.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, Madam Chair, and I have a question about the engagement that happened for this proposed action. And then another question is there any opposition to it?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Chambliss, the engagement process for this has been a part of the Orange Line engagement process that has been going on. Charles alluded to this schedule a little earlier, since 2014, including property owners, businesses in this area, existing Route 535 ridership, which the Orange Line will ultimately replace. I can't speak to it extensively. Charles might if there are more specific questions, but it has been going on per both council policy and what's required as part of our FTA requirements on the Small Starts project for some time. And then I just slipped my mind the second part. Opposition, no. We have strong support from the city of Richfield, Bloomington, Minneapolis, Burnsville, everything down the corridor of the counties. I think, yeah, I know of no opposition to this project.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council members? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2019-112, which is the same week item.
So moved.
The motion, is there a second? Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. And business item carries. We're on to item 2019-140.
So, Madam Chair, I'll present these items. 2019-140 and 2019-141 have very similar backgrounds. So I'll present the background of them together and then the specifics of them separately. But essentially, following the dissolution of the county's Transit Improvement Board, CTIB funding partners, so the counties, assumed the project funding commitments that CTIB had formerly made to the project. So this item relates to those funding commitments that were brought forward. The way that we translate those commitments into actual dollars is entering into subsequent agreements with the counties to transmit those funds that we would then use in implementing the project. So these two items relate to those actions. So we've done annual funding agreements with Dakota County. We did a similar agreement last year based on a grant application that council authorized and we made to Dakota County. And then also through amendments to the term and amount of actually an older CTIP grant from 2017 that Hennepin County now holds and is the grantor for. So that is the mechanism that we use to obtain county funding within that pie chart of the overall project budget, but making that available to the project. These actions in combination would make these additional county funds available to the project. And here are the actions themselves, but I will note that same week action is requested to more closely align with when our partners are taking action on these grants as well. Begin with 2019-140, which is with Dakota County. And this is that the Met Council authorized the regional administrator to negotiate and execute an interagency agreement with Dakota County Regional Railroad Authority for $1,680,000 to fund Metro Orange Line project activities. Pause for any questions.
Any questions from council members? If not, I entertain a motion to approve the business item.
Make a motion to approve the item.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. First one passes.
Madam Chair, 2019-141 is with Hennepin County in a similar fashion that the Met Council authorized the administrator to negotiate and execute Amendment 4 to Agreement 16I-092 with CTIB Hennepin County, increasing Hennepin County's participation by an additional $15,421,812 and extending the grant activity period through June 30th of 2020.
Any questions on this one? Not entertain a motion to approve the business item.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you. Next to switching projects. So we are on business items 2019-103, 122, 123, 138. And we have Robin Kaufman and Jim Alexander here. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Robin Kaufman. I'm the Director of Administration for the Light Rail Projects, and I am going to start with a right-of-way update and also a contract amendment business item. And then Jim will be covering the last three utility agreement amendments. So I thought I'd start really quickly with a right-of-way update as the project has progressed. Since this is a fairly large component of the project, we've been providing updates to the council, to the Transportation Committee on a quarterly basis, just to give the committee the status report on the acquisition process as well as the relocation process. So you can see here, this is a map. We have 153 privately owned parcels that we need to acquire for the project. And as of today, we have all 152 of those parcels acquired. There is one parcel that we continue to negotiate on. It is not needed for construction, so the good news is we have all of the property that we need in order to proceed with the construction activities. So you can see here, this is just a tabular form of that same information. The other component of the acquisition process is relocation. We have a little over 30 parcels that have displacees in them. There were a total of 179 displacees that we identified in late 2017 and early 2018. And so we've been working with those individuals. We've hired
relocation specialists that has been, actually 6 relocation specialists that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and they've been working with the property owners and the tenants for the last 2 to 3 years, basically identifying their needs and helping them find a new location, and then also helping them with their claims process. So as of today, we have 179 of those displacees have relocated. We have one that's their lease is up at the end of next month, and so they are on schedule to be relocated by the end of next month. So that is the good news. And just a little bit about since this is, I think, is your first right-of-way acquisition report. We've broken the relocations into 2 different categories. One is businesses or landlords, like businesses that were operating these business in the properties, and then also seasonal storage. So you can see that there was about 84 seasonal storage. A lot of those were boats, trailers, summer car, or convertibles or sports cars or classic cars that people didn't want in the Minnesota streets in the winter time. And so we've been processing all of these claims as we go through this process, and a lot of those seasonal storage displacees actually just relocated or took their cars out of storage basically last summer or last spring. And so the good news is that there was very minimal amount of relocation that we had to do with those. They just needed to find a new location this past fall. So primarily we've been focusing on the 94 businesses and landlords and helping them relocate and processing those claims. So that was my right-of-way update. If there are any questions, I'll go on to the business item.
Any questions? Councilmember Gonzalez?
Just a quick question. When you mentioned displacees.
Thank
you. And 179, is that actually individuals or households?
Madam Chair and committee member, the good news here is that we did not have any residential displacees. They were all businesses. So they were not, there may have been some individuals that owned property or, had a vehicle that was in storage. I think there was two office spaces that were being leased as, like 2 people were doing a home remodel, and so they leased the space so they could store their personal items in there, but there were no residential displacees in this process.
Councilmember Cummings?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In this process, is there, for the relocation experts, are they strongly partial to trying to keep the business within the community where they currently reside?
Madam Chair and committee member, that's been one of the goals. They've been trying to keep a lot of the displacees within the corridor. In some cases, I think they've been successful at that. Trying to think if there's a few. There's a few that have relocated. I can think of one that relocated from Hopkins and is now in New Hope. So they've had to move a little distance, but I think a good portion of them have been able to stay.
Just a quick follow-up, but not specifically outside of the corridor, but specifically within the city in which they were located. Was there an attempt made to focus on that?
Madam Chair and committee member, I think that was their first, if they could find, again, I don't know the specifics of all the properties. I could follow up, but I think that was one of their assumptions that they'd try to work through.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So the business item I'm presenting today is Wilson Development Services relocation contract amendment. Just a little bit of background is we issued the notice to proceed back in 2015, and we, through a competitive process, selected 7 relocation specialists to work with the businesses. We initially issued a total of $800,000 worth of contracts, so that was divided amongst the 7 contractors. At that time, we had only identified about 100 displacees, and so over time, we've had to amend the contract because, as I reported earlier, we went from 100 to 179. So we've had to amend the contracts a few times. And then at that time, we basically assigned the relocation specialists to specific tenants and specific buildings. We felt that it was really important that they were assigned and that they would be able to stay with the property or properties and the businesses throughout the process, just because it is a lengthy process, and we needed to be able to have that trust and knowledge and background and that relationship building to move through this process over the 3 or 4 years that it's taken. So we did do a few amendments. We amended 6 of the 7 contracts back in February to reflect the increased number, February of 2018. June, we had to amend another one of the contracts because there were some challenges that came up with two of their clients. And then we also amended another contract last fall. So we've had three amendments prior to this. We are now requesting amendment to the Wilson, one of the contractors, to add $50,000 to their contract. This company, Wilson Development Services, has some of the largest of the displacees and also some of the most complex of the displacees, and so we've had to add some additional funds. And then as we're concluding the relocation process, there's been some cases, basically one of the roles of the relocation specialist is to review all of their expenses and then determine what is eligible for reimbursement and what's not eligible under the Uniform Relocation Act, which is a federal requirement. So they've been going through there, and then we've been doing final notices, basically saying that we've submitted this amount and this is how much we're able to total reimburse you. There's several of the businesses that we've done that, and they're now appealing that process, and so we need to make sure that we have the consultants in place in order to support us through that process and our legal staff. So that's the request for the amendment. So you can see here, there's the table of the contracts, and you can see Wilson Development currently has about $300,000 in their contract. We're requesting an additional $50,000 for a total of $350,000 for their contract. And so, Madam Chair and Committee, my recommendation, or staff recommendation, is that the council approve the sole source contract amendment for this property owner and tenant advisory services contract with Wilson Development to increase their contract amount by $50,000 to $350,000.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Thank you.
I'll turn it over to Jim.
All right, Madam Chair, committee members, I'm Jim Alexander. I'm the project director for Southwest LRT. So I have 3 items. The first 2 relate to master utility agreements. Just a little background on master utility agreements. These are agreements that we signed back in 2017, and they relate to reimbursing utilities, certain utilities that have utilities along the corridor that need to be relocated. There's also a case where some of these utilities are located within street right-of-way, so we're using a MnDOT's notice and orders. So in that case, the utility is required to move at their expense. But in this case, when we're along freight rail corridor in particular, on the BNSF corridor and the Wayzata subdivision at the eastern end of the project, well, the project needs to pay for that reimbursement. And so the first one is CenturyLink Master Utility Agreement. And we are looking to amend this contract or this agreement by adding $2 million. So staff is recommending that the Met Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute an amendment to the CenturyLink Master Utility Agreement to add $2 million for a new total utility relocation reimbursement amount not to exceed $3.5 million. I just want to add that of these 2 items, actually all 3 of these items, we had identified these costs they are included in our $2.03 billion budget. Back in the time when we first signed these in 2017, we had limited information. We gathered more information over 2017 and 2018 and came up with these costs, and we identified these back in May when we boosted up the project budget to that $2 million figure. And now that things are underway with our civil contractor LMJV, we'd like to get these amended. So, Madam Chair, for your consideration.
Thank you. Any questions for the presenter? Okay, if not, I entertain a motion to approve the first one, 2019-122 with CenturyLink.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second? All those in favor, or any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
All right, Madam Chair, looks like I lost my,
Yeah.
my feed here. Maybe it'll come back in a moment.
There.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so the next item, 2019-123 is similar with, this time with CenterPoint, Master Utility Agreement Amendment. And with that, we're looking to have the Met Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute an amendment to the CenterPoint Energy Master Utility Agreement to add a total of $200,000 to the utility relocation reimbursement amount, which would bring it to a not to exceed $1 million. Madam Chair.
Any questions from council members? Not entertain a motion to approve?
So moved.
Motion, is there a second? Second. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Business is approved. And next one.
Madam Chair, I seem to be having challenges, but we boost up here. Okay. All right. So the last item is related to Canadian Pacific. Canadian Pacific has a line that runs over above the Southwest LRT alignment in the St. Louis Park area near Louisiana Avenue. And what this current agreement we have with Canadian Pacific is to compensate CP for their expenses to do the connection of the freight track that our contractor is going to build, called the Southerly Connector. And what this amendment is for is to address a utility AT&T that we'd be as a pass-through. We go through CP to reimburse AT&T for utility relocation costs. And with that, the recommendation is that the Met Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute an amendment to the Canadian Pacific Connecting Track Agreement to add $300,000 to the agreement reimbursement of AT&T utility relocation costs. With this amendment, the total agreement is not to exceed $799,000. With that, Madam Chair, I'm glad to take any questions.
All right. Any questions? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this could apply to all of these. So when the utilities relocate their utilities, do they also take that opportunity to upgrade to whatever current technology is? And if so, do the costs of the project also go toward the upgrade of equipment and technology, or is it simply determined what the cost to have moved that is?
Madam Chair, Committee member, that's actually a really good question. As far as I know, and the way we've been treating this is if they have a pipe or a conduit or anything like that, it's really the same material that gets moved that was there. We don't typically like to have betterments in that case, and we really look to reimburse them for changing their existing condition and putting it in a different location.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Not, I entertain a motion to approve item 2019-138.
So moved.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. And the motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, council members, so we need to determine what goes on consent and what doesn't. I would propose that items 1 and 6 through 9 proceed on consent agenda to the full council. Items 3 through 5 are same week, so they will appear on the full agenda on Wednesday. And then item 2, because we did have a dissenting vote, would go to the full council. Any comments, questions, disagreement? Okay, that's what we'll do. All right, then we are moving on to our information item. And the first one, we have John Harper here to talk about first quarter ridership. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, and good afternoon again. I'm before you at this point to talk about first quarter Met Council ridership. And before I go into the report itself, I just wanted to frame up the sort of how this presentation works and the schedule of this presentation for you. The presentation that we do is quarterly. The first 3 quarters of the year, we normally as staff bring for you the Met Council ridership. So that includes Metro Transit and includes MTS contracted work. The final ridership report of the year that summarizes the entire year, we do the same Met Council presentation, and then we add on to that a regional perspective that includes the other transit providers in the region, the suburban providers, and others that might be out there. We bring the item to you normally the first transportation committee meeting 1 month after the quarter closes. That allows us to close the quarter, allows us to review the ridership, make sure that we've got the numbers right, look for any sort of conclusions or nuggets of information we might bring forward to you, and then bring it to you. So we are talking today about Q1. And I know it was 90 degrees last week, but it was not 90 degrees in January and February, and we'll talk more about that as I go through the presentation. So keep that in mind. So this is January, February, March of 2019. And the ridership report compares 2019 to 2018, so there are some numbers in the report, and there's also some comparison to previous years. This first slide shows you the Q1 ridership by month as it compares to 2018 trend line, and you'll see that we are below 2018 and 2019. And we'll break out in just a moment here the specific modes of service and how those compare to the 2018 numbers. The next slide shows the various modes of service, and this doesn't change a whole lot from quarter to quarter. The local bus service is the workhorse of our bus system, our transit system, and more than half of our ridership is delivered on local bus. That is urban local, suburban local type service. The light rail, the Green Line and Blue Line service carries a little more than a quarter of our ridership, and the remainder of our ridership is spread across other modes that you see on this slide, including commuter and express service, our demand responsive modes, including our Metromobility service and our Transit Link service that we talked about earlier today. And we have a small van pool program that we operate. So you see how those numbers compare here. To get into the actual numbers, we are essentially down in almost all the areas. The one area where we are growing a little bit is in our Metromobility service. Christine Kennan will talk in a little bit about our Metromobility program specifically, but that program, as you'll see in a conclusion slide in a moment, grows. It has been growing at about 6% a year over the last 5 or 6 years. And so that to see that grow is not a surprise. I will get to some conclusions in a moment here, but just let you see the numbers here. So to talk through some observations, the first quarter, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, was cold, and you may remember that we had some snow, and we had some bad weather days, a few more in the first quarter of this year than we did in the first quarter of last year. Got a slide after the observations here that will put some more emphasis on that. So the challenges really in all the modes were the bad weather days. We are still seeing some impacts of fare increase and people making some decisions. Transit Link service in particular, it's not a huge program, but when we did the fare increase, we essentially doubled that fare from matching the fixed route services from the fare perspective to matching the Metromobility fare on our Transit Link program, and that I think we're still seeing a fallout in that program from that fare increase specifically. The North Star ridership is down only slightly from 2017's historic high, so that's I would say that is good news. And what we see, and I think what Cole Hineker will talk about in a little bit, is we do see that ridership is strong in those areas where we have focused service with the arterial BRTs, with the light rail lines, the C line that just opened this weekend, where we have focused our investment, we've focused our service frequency and our service speed. We have seen that do well, and in other areas we are struggling for these reasons that we've talked about today. I want to show you a slide here that is not normally in the presentation, but it was noteworthy, so we added this slide. And this is to show you the first 3 months of this year. And this slide shows you essentially by day the ridership. And you can see as you go left to right that the weekday ridership, 5 weekdays have high numbers, and then there's a Saturday and a Sunday that are kind of medium, low, and then back up to the 5 weekdays as you move across. When want to point out that that there are half dozen or so days within the first quarter where you'll see the yellow down arrows in the presentation and the red down arrow that show that there was weather impact that essentially took our weekday and made it a Saturday or a Sunday holiday level ridership. And if you take a half dozen of those across a 3-month period and suppress the ridership like we saw here, that can definitely have a downward impact. And I think you see that in the numbers in the first quarter. So this was noteworthy enough that we added this to the presentation, that this is not normally part of this. So you can see that, and I can answer any questions you might have beyond what this shows, or Mr. Pellegrin or Mr. Thompson might be able to help as well.
Councilmember Sterner.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. I guess I'm just still amazed with the numbers because we had the Super Bowl, we had the Final Four, plus the Twins started playing in March, and it seemed like those had really good numbers to offset some of these cold days, but we're still down from the year before. But I think it was all more weather related, is what you're, even with those extra riders from out of town and such riding our system.
Yes, Madam Chair and Committee Member Sterner. Was the Super Bowl in 2018?
2018.
So wasn't wasn't this year,
And
but the Final
Four was in 2019.
That was in April.
And
Yeah,
that-
Final Four was the
so
next
actually the
quarter.
Super Bowl.
Okay, so we're going to get those numbers next week. Okay.
If the Twins had better pitching, we'd be.
Yep, and there was cold there,
2018
so
would be a bit
once
better,
right
yeah,
space. Okay, there we go. So I think next quarter, good. All right, thank you.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on the observations, local bus BRT ridership express, everything mentioned is something that is beyond our control, except for the fare increase. So I'm wondering if there is, which had obviously clearly a negative effect on ridership, are we looking at anything to mitigate the challenge of the fare increase and the negative ridership that caused?
Director Thompson.
Madam Chair, committee members, I can handle that. When we made that fare increase, we did know there would be an impact on ridership, and we expected a full almost 18 months to get back to the ridership levels we were prior to the fare increase. But I think when that council made that decision, that concern with the fare increase, one of the major programs was the transit access or transit assistant pass, which basically created that low income fare. And so that really created an offset for those that fare increase really had an impact on. And then I think we've been adding staff and really ramping up that marketing of that programming since the fare increase to try to offset some of that impact on some, and as one of the key investments. The change in Transit Link, I think, was just more to bring that service up to where a dial-a-ride fee should normally be set. And so we knew there'd be a pretty substantial impact on that particular service, but we thought, the council thought that was the right fare to have for that dial-a-ride to match up with Metro Mobility. So I think we're probably approaching, the fare increase was October of 2017. So we're getting probably near that 18-month period where we'd maybe start to see back to those levels, barring weather and construction and a few other things.
Thank you.
Councilmember Zarin.
It's just kind of obvious to me, I'd like to ask this question, that of course when there's cold weather, people don't want to stand out there. So did we take the time to examine our bus shelters and figure out if we're providing shelter from the wind and if our heaters are all working and that sort of stuff? I know it's it's tough to keep up on that stuff throughout the winter, but I think that's a legitimate question to ask.
COO Pelger?
Sure. Uh, Madam Chair, members of the council, um, we've had, the last couple of years, we've had an ongoing program to put in new bus shelters, many with heat. It's been a large increase over the last couple of years, so we've done a really good job with that. It's interesting to note that sometimes in inclement weather, particularly on North Star, people don't like to drive in. So North Star has much higher ridership in inclement weather, snowstorms. But when you have a polar vortex where it's minus 30 degrees, people are, doesn't matter. Nobody's going anywhere.
Right.
We've seen that. So, and plus the issue of gasoline prices and all that goes along with that have affected our ridership. So, but we have had a large effort in improving our shelters, and on the platforms at light rail, we've put in new heaters and tried to keep those working. Those have been problematic for us. A lot of vandalism that happens to those things. So you're right. It is tough to keep up with those, but we're making those efforts.
Okay, Director Thompson.
Madam Chair and council members, I'd also add to that, on these particular 5 days, I think most schools were closed and a lot of businesses either closed. It was very abnormal weather days on these. And so a lot of businesses asked their employees to stay home or gave them that option. So that was part of the weather impact too, that a lot of the normal trips just didn't need to be made because of some closure related to that too. So that had some impact. I mean, that was reflected in these days too.
I do recall seeing these before, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. There were things even like the highway construction on 35W, and even during the Super Bowl, a lot of downtown businesses told their employees to work from home during those times, and we could see that in some of our numbers. So, Councilmember Sterner.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I just was wondering if there's any rough projections with the new BRTs, like the C line opening on Saturday, the Orange line seems like it's going to be coming. How much more would go to BRT and percentage of our ridership?
Madam Chair and committee member, I don't have that. I think that we can certainly present that at a future time. I think maybe Cole Hineker's presentation here will talk a little bit about Transitway ridership in comparison. That certainly is a higher productivity service. We saw a significant jump in the Snelling Avenue corridor when the A line was implemented. I think it was an 80% increase in ridership.
Yeah.
By adding the limited stop nature of the arterial BRT compared to the 84 increased that ridership in the corridor significantly. And so I would imagine we'll see that same sort of bump.
Right, thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the council, on the A line, which is what he's talking about, the Snelling corridor, we have seen large increases up initially about 64%, I believe it was, and we've seen large increases in those corridors. Statistically, there are some ridership projections for C line. I'm not sure what those is, but I can get those numbers for you. It takes a while for people to, get used to the service. The reason we do BRT is because it's a faster bus going to the same place. That's the kind of service it is, and when you have a local bus on the same corridor, it's the ridership increases that incremental amount because it is a faster bus.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we'll get some information out to you. Councilmember Fredson.
Thanks, Chair. So slide 8 and 9 I find really interesting, and I thank you for including that in the presentation. Beyond, say, 1+ inches of snow, I'd actually be, and maybe you've looked at this data, but interested to know if there was a certain temperature threshold or threshold of schools that were closed. My own attitude about, 1 inch of snow doesn't really slow me down, but I think a school closure or a certain temperature might keep me inside, so. That's just my 2 cents.
Madam Chair, members of the council, typically when it goes below 0, we see, a huge increase. When it's 30 below 0, I've lived here for 23 years. I've never seen 30 below 0, so that was a new experience for all of us. By example, we have auxiliary heaters in our buses. We couldn't operators we couldn't get the temperature below 50 degrees inside the bus with auxiliary heaters. We've never seen things like that. So we're seeing a lot of those kinds of things, and the ridership certainly suffered. Um, we've got snowstorms pretty much down to a science. If it's a nice fluffy snowstorm, that doesn't slow us down much. But if it's one of them wet, slippery March ones, that slows us down a lot, particularly if it gets a little ice underneath it. We have problems. So ridership suffers, on-time performance suffers, which is what operations are sensitive to, is the on-time performance, because that's how we live, is bus on time. So we have that pretty much down to a science. But excellent question.
And Madam Chair and committee member, if you look at the presentation here, the 3 days with a significant decrease in ridership were the polar vortex days. The 1-inch snow days, as denoted by the asterisk across the top, had an impact on ridership in some of those days, but the real significant was the weather. So I think people did concur with you, committee member, that it's the cold weather that drives you home, not the inch of snow.
Okay. Any additional questions? All right, thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
All right, next on our agenda is Transit Systems Performance Evaluation. We have Cole Henniker, Daniel Pena, and Andrew Degerstrom.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Cole Henniker, and I actually was in front of the committee of the whole about a month ago talking about transit with you all. So I think this is a really good building off of that first presentation. We're laying some groundwork information about what we consider when doing transit planning, and today we're just going to lay some kind of foundational information about how the transit system performs, and especially over time. So we actually do a transit system performance evaluation every couple of years. We have a new report that we expect to be available by the end of the month, and so we'll be sharing that with council members once the full report is available. But we're just going to bring you some basics today. We're actually going to cover only 2 topics, but I wanted to mention that the report has additional information, particularly about demographics and travel trends. And then we have a section about successes and opportunities, where we actually tell more specific stories about things that we've invested in, like A-Line and how it's performing, outside of the context of kind of the bigger picture numbers, where some of those nuances get lost. So I would encourage you to look at it when we send it. And today, we're going to focus on some high-level concepts, but one of the things, and I know Councilmember Alice Ingerbretson said she couldn't be here today and said she might have some thoughts about different things we could be looking at for measurement-wise. That would be great feedback for us to try to work towards for the next report, which we'll do in about 2 years. So just with that in mind, you know, the information we're presenting today is part of the report that's already going to be published, but we're always welcoming input on different ways we can be measuring that. So that would be feedback that would certainly be helpful. I'm actually just here to introduce Daniel Pena and Andrew Degerstrom. They both work in Metropolitan Transportation Services, where I work. Daniel actually came here about 2.5 years ago from California, from the private sector. We somehow convinced him to move to Minnesota. I still don't really know how.
Me neither. I don't know why.
Yeah. And Andrew just recently graduated last year from the Humphrey Institute, and he's currently an intern both in MTS and in the TOD office. So he's got actually a pretty good exposure to the different things we do at council from the transit perspective. And so I'm going to turn it over to Daniel and Andrew, and I'll just stay up here for questions.
Madam Chair, committee members, again, hello, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Pena. I'm a planner with Metropolitan Transportation Services.
And I'm Andrew Degerstrom, intern with MTS and the TOD office at Metro Transit.
And we are here today to discuss the transit system performance evaluation. So for today's agenda, we are going to discuss what the transit system performance evaluation is, why we do it, and share just some of the findings in the most recent edition of the report. Minnesota statute requires that prior to each transportation policy plan update that the Metropolitan Council conduct a transportation system performance evaluation. And in addition to that, statute requires that a transit system performance evaluation be conducted every 2 years, which is what we're going to discuss today. As part of that statute, the state also requires that the transit system performance evaluation also include a comparison of our transit performance with select peer regions throughout the country. These reports, the Transportation System Performance Evaluation and Transit System Performance Evaluation, were first performed in 1997 and 1999, respectively. The Transportation Policy Plan contains several key outcomes for transit in the region. These include that transit be efficient, cost-effective, reliable, that it attract more transit riders, provide more access to jobs, attract businesses and residences, supports focused land uses that integrate transportation modes, and that transit support equity, clean air, and healthy communities. So before we go forward, I just want to let everyone know for your context that the evaluations that we'll go over today include performance metrics for all transit service providers in the region. So now we'll look at transit performance trends within the region itself. The metrics analyzed in this report include ridership efficiency as measured by passengers per in-service hour, and cost effectiveness as measured by subsidy per passenger. We are paying particular attention to these metrics since these standards have identified standards in our transportation policy plan. I'll provide more details on these measures in upcoming slides. And the majority of these following analyses are done by service type. These service types, there's different service types in the region that match the different transit markets that you find within the region. So first, we'll go into ridership, and I just want to start out by saying that these trends go up to 2017 due to the fact that the peer data we have available goes up to 2017, and we just want to maintain consistency within the report. As you can see here on the very left, the service type that carries the most passengers in the region is core local bus services. Despite that fact, you're seeing a general decline in bus ridership outside of APRT services. Light rail, on the other hand, has seen an increase in ridership since 2013. Some of these trends are partially explained by the fact that some ridership that you found on core local bus services has migrated over to some of the light rail services we provide in the region. And here's just ridership in 2017 by itself. As you can see, despite declines in bus ridership, the majority, the service type with the most ridership in the region is still that core local bus service, followed by light rail service, which carries around 26% of the ridership in the region, and commuter and express bus services, which carry around 14% of ridership in the region. And here we have a comparison of transitway ridership, which includes light rail, commuter rail, and arterial BRT services, and overall other fixed route services. As you see, transitways have started to play a greater and greater role in the transit network in the region. In 2013, transitway services made up around 13% of total regional fixed route ridership in the region. In 2017, those services made up 30% of ridership in the region. Now we're taking a look at efficiency in the region as measured by passengers per in-service hours. When we consider all service types, those two big groups that you see right there, those are our rail modes. Commuter rail and light rail are just in a class of their own in terms of how efficient they are. They carry over 200 passengers per hour, and their efficiency is increasing as the ridership on our rail modes in the region are increasing as well. When we look at efficiency without paying, when excluding rail, we see that the most efficient services that we have in the region are our core local bus services and our arterial BRT services. Those services carry between average 30 to 40 passengers per hour. Outside of arterial BRT, efficiency is declining though. That is a matter of the fact that as our ridership declines, the amount of passengers that we carry per hour is declining as well. And worth noting also as well is the low passengers per hour in our 88 dial-a-ride service of Metro Mobility. That's due just to the nature of the service. Metro Mobility requires doesn't require, but it does offer door-to-door service and also requires that there is assistance to passengers given to them as well. So due to that fact, there's just more time required per trip on Metro Mobility services. And our dial-a-ride services average between 2 to 3 passengers per hour as of 2017. And here is our cost-effectiveness measures. They tend to be correlated with our efficiency. We measure it by subsidy per passenger, which is the cost incurred per trip, taking into account fare box revenues. Services with lower efficiency tend to incur the highest cost. Bus services are seeing increased subsidy per passenger as well, and that tends to correlate just with the general decline in ridership that you're seeing in them. As their ridership goes down, their efficiency goes down, and their cost that it takes to provide that service goes up per trip. As mentioned before, the Transportation Policy Plan defines performance standards for efficiency and cost effectiveness. These are meant to assist our transit providers in the region in evaluating their services and designing their services. In terms of routes meeting minimum efficiency standards, 94% of our core local routes are meeting their weekday standards for efficiency, while 69% of commuter and express bus services and 64% of our suburban local bus services are meeting their weekday standards for service. In terms of the performance standards for cost effectiveness, we see, in terms of our bus services, we see that 81% of suburban bus local routes are meeting their standards, while at the lower end, 64% of supporting local bus services are meeting their cost effectiveness standards. And here we have operating spending on the left and ridership on the right by service types. And here's just to show you somewhat what the relationship between operating spending and ridership is in the region. As you would expect, the 3 service types with the greatest ridership, which is core local bus services, commuter and express services, and light rail services, also incurred the greatest operating costs in the region. Worth noting, though, is the discrepancy between dial-a-ride ridership and operating costs. Again, that's due to the nature of dial-a-ride. It requires more resources per trip, though Metro Mobility only makes up 2.5% of ridership in the region, it takes up 13% of the operating costs that we spend in the region as of 2017. This slide shows some of the trends that we're seeing in park and ride usage and capacity. The region has spent a significant amount of resources in the past decade or so on expanding the park and ride system. As you can see, that growth in park and ride demand, though, has stalled more or less since 2013, despite some increases in capacity for our park and ride system. This chart here shows our evaluations, one of our evaluations for transit accessibility in the region. Here we're using the standard measure for transit accessibility, which is the population that is within a quarter mile of a bus stop that receives service in the region. You see here that 14% of the region's population has access to high-frequency service, which we define as service that runs every 15 minutes or better on weekdays and Saturdays. And also 61% of the region's population has access to non-high frequency service, and 25% of the regional population has access to no fixed route service. They're not within a quarter mile of a bus stop. Though that population does have access to the general purpose dial-a-ride service that we provide in the region, which is TransitLink service.
Just a quick question. Is the area there defined by the transit taxing district or the whole region?
This evaluation here, if I remember correctly, is for the whole region.
Thank you.
But I'll get back to you with the definite answer. An important tool that the Metropolitan Council has for understanding transit demand in the region is our transit market areas. The The region is divided into 5 different transit market areas, each one which represents a different level of transit demand that we can find in the region. These transit market areas are defined by their population employment density, their automobile availability, and several land use considerations. The highest level of demand is found in Transit Market Area 1, which is the dark blue in the center there in the urban core, while the lowest level of transit demand is found in Transit Market Area 5, which is that beige region, which is mostly the rural communities in the region. And also in the transportation policy plan, sorry about that, we also have defined service standards for each transit market area. So what we see here is that 95% of the population in Transit Market Area 1 has access to service that meets our standards for Transit Market Area 1. 91% of the population in Transit Market Area 2 has access to service that meets the standards that we had set for Transit Market Area 2. And 67% of the population in Transit Market Area 3 has access to transit service that meets our standards for Transit Market Area 3. So the takeaways for our regional performance evaluation that we've conducted here is that bus, as John Harper had mentioned before, bus ridership is declining, but despite that, bus service makes up the majority of ridership in the region. The demand for transitway services has remained strong, particularly for light rail. The introduction of arterial BRT, which at the time of this report was only the A line, was successful. And again, as John Harper had mentioned before, that demand for metro mobility service is increasing and consuming a larger share of available transit funds. And that demand for park and ride service has leveled off in recent years. And now I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, who's going to discuss how we are performing in comparison with our peers.
Do we want to pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions? You're a quiet group. Go ahead.
Good evening, Madam Chair and council members. Once again, my name is Andrew Degerstrom, and I will be going through the peer region transit analysis. Data for this analysis comes from the National Transit Database. For each region, which we geographically define as the urbanized area, all transit providers and modes are aggregated into a single regional performance measure. Here we have a map showing Twin Cities along with our 12 peer transit regions. Transit peer regions were first established in 1996 and are based on regions similar in both size and composition of transit service. We do re-evaluate our peer regions periodically for changes in transit agencies, transit modes, and regional demographics. So this chart shows broadly the different transit modes operating in our peer regions as of 2017. One transit mode, Madam Chair, council members, that you might have a question about is hybrid rail. Hybrid rail is defined as a rail system primarily operating routes on the national system of railroads, but not operating with characteristics of commuter rail, typically operating in light rail type vehicles, and must operate with temporal separation from freight rail traffic. So these are the investment and performance measures included in this presentation. As Cole mentioned earlier, there are additional measures included in the full report. One thing to note is that all per capita measures are used as 2010 census population by urbanized area. So the first slide we have here is operating spending per capita for 2017 for our peer transit regions. Operating spending is all spending associated with the operation of a transit agency. Seattle spends the most in transit operations among all the peer regions, spending about $383 per capita in 2017. Here in the Twin Cities, we spent approximately same amount on transit operations as the peer average, spending approximately $193 per capita compared to the peer average of $192 per capita. Here we're looking at average annual capital spending per capita for the years 2007 to 2017. We average 10 years of spending because in any given region, timelines for capital projects can lead to significant differences in capital spending year to year. So averaging the 10 years together allows us to get a better picture of actual capital spending. You can see here Seattle and Denver are a little bit of outliers on this chart. With Seattle, Seattle's 10-year average of $324 per capita and Denver's average of $261 per capita. Because of these two regions, we actually had less capital spending per capita than the peer region average, spending approximately $110 per capita to the peer average of $112 per capita. If we were to not include Seattle and Denver in this list, we would be performing higher than the peer average for this metric. Here we have total ridership for 2017. Note that this is not per capita ridership. Seattle's total ridership was significantly higher than the rest of the peer regions at 198.3 million rides in 2017. Here in the Twin Cities, we had 95.5 million rides, which is above the peer average of 86.8 million. Here we're actually looking at ridership per capita. Looking at ridership per capita, the results become a little less skewed. If you remember the previous chart, Seattle was a lot higher than the rest of the peer regions. Seattle still had the highest ridership per capita ridership in 2017 with 64.8 rides per capita. Portland close second at 60.7 rides per capita. Here in the Twin Cities, we did perform better than the peer average of 36 rides per capita compared with the peer average of 34.2 rides per capita. So this chart looks at spending per capita versus ridership per capita, and that spending includes both the operating spending per capita and that 10-year average annual capital spending per capita. Note Seattle, Portland, Baltimore, and Denver in the top of that chart there. They show the positive relationship between regions that invest more heavily in both transit operations and transit capital expansion and higher ridership per capita. This chart here looks at percent change ridership from 2013 to 2017. Note that although the overall trend across our peer regions is declining ridership, not every region saw peak ridership in the same year. Seattle is the only region among our peers that have seen ridership increases every year from 2013 to 2017. Here we can start getting into some more of the performance measures. This chart shows subsidy per passenger for 2017, which is a measure of cost effectiveness that we just didn't talk about in the previous section. San Diego performed the best among all the peers with a subsidy per passenger of $2.53. In the Twin Cities, we did perform slightly better than the peer average with a subsidy per passenger of $4.08 compared, $4.20 compared to the peer average of $4.53. Here we're looking at passengers per revenue hour for 2017, which is a measure of productivity or efficiency, which is also mentioned in the last section. Portland had the highest productivity among the peer regions with 35 passengers per revenue hour. Here in the Twin Cities, we actually performed worse than the peer average with 23.5 passengers per revenue hour compared to the peer average of 24.2 passengers per revenue hour. One factor that can explain why we perform worse relative to our peers is the breakdown of regional hours of service by mode. So here we have revenue hours for dial ride, fixed route, and van pool and other modes, broken down as percentages of total overall regional revenue hours. In the Twin Cities, dial ride service comprised approximately 39% of total regional revenue hours, second only to Baltimore with 41%. We know from the previous section that because of the nature of dial ride, as being a door-to-door service, it tends to be less cost-effective and less productive compared to other transit modes. Increasing demand for metro mobility in our region has led to dial ride services comprising of a larger percentage of regional revenue hours, which impacts how we perform relative to our peers. So some key takeaways for the peer comparisons. So going back to that chart showing spending versus ridership per capita, there's a positive relationship between transit investment and ridership. Seattle, Portland, and Baltimore were the top three regions for operating spending per capita, capital spending per capita, and ridership per capita. Denver was in the top four for two of those three measures, and Seattle ranked first for all three of those. Generally, ridership has declined across our peer regions from 2013 to 2017. Seattle was the only region to have ridership increases every year from 2013 to 2017. Trend in decrease in productivity, which was the passengers per revenue hour across peer regions, generally matches with the trend of decline of ridership. And like I just mentioned, the high share of dial ride service impacts transit performance in the Twin Cities region compared with our peer regions. And with that, we will be happy to stand for questions.
Questions from council members. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is it too soon, or is there a way to assess the impact of ride-sharing services that are becoming more and more popular on the impact on the numbers?
I would, committee members, Madam Chair, I would like to include that in the next performance evaluation if there is room for it. I do know that Metro Transit does have a shared mobility effort that might be addressing those concerns, and hopefully we can implement those findings into the next edition of this report.
Yeah, and I would say maybe a little too soon just because we don't really have great data on what those providers are providing. But our actually surveying of travelers in the region is gathering more information on shared mobility modes, and so it might provide us with enough information to start drawing more conclusions. But we tend to just lack data about what they're doing to be able to make those comparisons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Just have a question about the specific cities. Why are they peers? Is that due to population size, or what's the nature of their peership with Twin Cities?
Yeah, I can take that since that's okay, Madam Chair.
Mhm.
So we actually started with a list back in the 90s that was based a lot on the size of the region from a population perspective. And you can imagine when we first developed the list of peers, there was no rail here. So we were actually just looking for a similar sized region and a similar sized transit system.
Okay.
So one example is Tampa Bay has always been a very similar sized region population wise, but they don't have as elaborate of a transit system as we have here. And so we wanted kind of comparable systems. We have changed this list over the years. Cincinnati used to be a peer. They are no longer a peer. We've added San Diego and Phoenix over the years because of the size of their transit system has grown substantially. So as Andrew said, we look to adapt it, but we primarily look at population. These are all regions that are within about 10 to 15 in the terms of the rank across the country of where they are in total population. And then they're similar in terms of their transit use. One thing that I was going to mention, having tracked these for over a decade now, is it is interesting to see some regions kind of going up even over the decade in investments in ridership, and some regions really falling off to the point where they're almost not a peer anymore because their system is so disinvested in. But we haven't dropped them yet. Maybe they'll have a turnaround. But.
Councilmember Sterner.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just was seeing if we could drill down. We got the high level, why certain cities do better than others, but have you really identified like where Seattle is really getting success? What little bites are they doing to have a really successful growing system in that? And are we tracking it? And if you have, but that's what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, Madam Chair, and I'll let Andrew weigh in too. I think our best attempts to look at that is to look at some of these metrics, like how much are they investing and are those investments showing returns? The other thing we know, particularly when we look at per capita rider data, is we are looking at 2010 census. You can imagine if that region is growing faster than the rest of the nation, their per capita number is still at the 2010 number, but their ridership is probably growing a lot faster. And so that's just one of the drawbacks of using, 9-year-old census data. But we also we're pretty confident that the investments these regions are making is part of what's contributing to their transit ridership. And so that's why we tried to present it as, how much are they investing versus what's the ridership as a good comparison tool. But we certainly are always trying to talk to the regions and figure out if we can learn, why are they growing so fast? And I think one of our maybe goals for the future report is to have more of a qualitative analysis, not just quantitative.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions? Okay. All right, thank you, gentlemen.
And I would just note, as I said, we will send a notification to you all when the report is available, and you can certainly ask questions once you see the full report.
Very good, thank you. Last on our agenda tonight, we have Christine Kinnan here to talk about Metro Mobility On-Demand Service. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Christine Kennan. I'm the Senior Manager of Metro Mobility. And you may recall a couple of months ago, Director Thompson and I were in front of the Committee of the Whole giving a large presentation and giving you an overview of our entire system. And within that presentation, we talked about some of the service options we were examining at the time to kind of relieve some of the pressures on our system. And today I'm here to talk about one of those, which is our on-demand services RFP. So just as a reminder, we are a shared ride public transportation service for certified riders who are unable to use the regular fixed route buses or trains at least some of the time due to their disability or health condition. We served about 2.38 million rides last year, and we have a year over year, as been mentioned, ridership increase of about 6%. With an overall ridership growth in the last 5 years of 30%. I mentioned a subsidy per ride on this slide of $28.68, which is a little higher than what you saw in Daniel's presentation, which is about close to 26 in 2017. So it is growing, and that's one of the reasons why we are looking to mitigate not only the pressure of the growing demand on our system, but the increase in costs. Along with our main contracts that provide the ADA paratransit service, we do have an alternative service contract currently in place with a taxi company. We do call it the Premium On-Demand System. It is an optional service for customers. We've had it since 2004 with a taxi provider exclusively. It is available to any certified customer. Some of the drawbacks are there are a limited number of accessible vehicles in the fleet, and we have a much greater rate of denials for trips for customers who are requesting a ride because they use a wheelchair lift, an accessible ride. So we have a disproportionate and disparate impact for denials with our taxi system for customers that need a lift service. It does provide, though, a same-day booking as well as an advance booking. The council pays a subsidy up to $15 per ride. Our exposure is capped at $15. How that model works is the customer pays the first $5, the council pays the next $15 of the cost, and if the cost of the ride is more than $20, the customer pays the remaining. We had a supplemental service contract in place through the end of March of this year, but due to very low ridership, very high subsidy rates, and a decreasing rate of demand or denial on our main system, those contracts were let to expire in March. As has been mentioned throughout, it's almost like there's been a theme of presentations today, but there has been a lot of interest in the growing demand and increasing costs of the Metro Mobility system, of course, especially at the legislative level. And I put this slide in here to talk about the Metro Mobility Legislative Task Force that was formed in 2017 because it really did do a lot of the examination of service options during that 6 months of the task force work, and it did help inform some of our decisions as far as the scope of our work on a request for proposal for on-demand service that we're looking and working at now. Chair Barber was co-chair of that task force, so I know she's very familiar with it. But the goals of the task force were basically to identify options to increase the program effectiveness and efficiency, to minimize program costs, improve service, including potential partnerships with taxi services and transportation network companies. And I find it interesting that we had a taxi contract for more than 10 years before that was put in as a goal. But I think the real focus was around the transportation network companies, the Ubers and the Lyfts and competitors like that. There were subcommittees formed throughout the duration of the task force that really dove in to cost implications of our system, as well as impacts of other models, the industry experience, other companies, other agencies around the country that were partnering with transportation network companies. What were their experiences, as well as what's locally provided here offer, including our own providers of ADA paratransit. And then also a very important customer experience group that was really looking at the needs of the customer and the pros and cons of various service options as it related to that experience. They did come back with some key recommendations that were delivered in February of 2018, and that was that the council should pilot and promote an on-demand service provision. They gave a timeline of the first quarter of 2019, so we're a little bit behind that, but it's a complex question. That we should study and invest in technology innovations, and that we should evaluate options for increased flexibility on Metro Mobility non-ADA trips. So this slide is a graphic that I won't go through in detail, certainly, but it does give you a matrix of the service options that were recommended through the task force, in addition to the base services, which are headed in green there, the Metro Mobility System. In addition to the recommendation that we need to invest in and sustain that system, that there was a potential for 4 additional service options, kind of divided into 2 buckets. One would be a shared option for on-demand, and one would be a premium option for on-demand. And within those shared and premium, there's 2 different service levels that would be important to our customers, and that would be one that has specialized transportation services, that high level of service needed, serving people with special disabilities and more attentive care, and then the non-STS, which would just basically be a curb-to-curb, non-specialized service, not necessarily serving people with disabilities, just but serving the general public.
And just a general note, the entire report is on our website.
Yes.
So you can easily go look at all of the information that went into this, and even the cost analysis and the service analysis.
Yeah, that's
might be
also
helpful
posted.
background.
It's quite detailed, and I couldn't possibly capture it here, but I did want to give that context. And, I think is a takeaway for me working closely with that was, a true realization through especially the customer experience group that our customer base is not a one-size-fits-all customer base. We've got customers that can take fixed routes sometimes. We've got customers that don't need that attentive door-through-door service. They're fine with curb-to-curb. We've got some customers that don't want to be escorted and have non-escort waivers in our system. So why should we have a one-size-fits-all transit system serving that customer base? And so I think that's a big takeaway for the service options. And it also, it formed our kind of work over the course of the last year to examine what's really out there and to identify the goals of our pilot. And it's really to basically examine what is the service market potential for offering an on-demand TNC ride-hailing service for Metro Mobility customers. What will it do? Will our customers grab hold of this? Some people really hate the idea, and some people really love the idea. So what is the actual market potential? Will it shift ridership off of our more expensive ADA paratransit service onto the lesser expensive service option, or will it be just creating new demand for mobility and adding overall to our system? And we won't know that until we start to deliver it. Also, is there a potential first mile, last mile interest in this? I think I mentioned concurrently, we're also looking at a fixed route pilot incentive where we're examining, whether we can incentivize our customers to use a fixed route. And so looking at this, if will our customers actually use a TNC to get to a rail platform or a bus station and transfer there. And so we'll be looking at that as well. But, also just exploring the program impacts. There is a potential for overall reduction of program costs, a capped subsidy of $15 per ride versus an increasing subsidy of over $28 per ride now on the main system. But what will it do as far as program administration costs? Will partnering with our TNC partners or ride-hailing partners, will they be willing to share the data we need to assist our planning efforts? And notoriously, that industry has not done that. And there's varying levels of success that transit agencies have had in reaching agreement, but looking at the impacts of maybe taking on a partner that doesn't share as much data. And then what are the ongoing technology options that we could bring, faring solutions, trip brokering solutions, et cetera. And then, of course, measuring the customer experience. You know, will wait times for Metro Mobility customers roughly match the wait times of the general public or not? Will driver and customer satisfaction ratings roughly match what is typical for the general public? You know, the in-app ratings that are common in this industry. What are their service denial implications, and how do those compare with our taxi contract? And you know, just the unknown of the drivers in this industry. The driver gets to choose whether or not they're going to take a requested ride. It's not dispatched in the way a taxi is, and so just looking at those kinds of customer experiences will be important throughout the duration of the pilot. And then just the real capacity to have an accessible service delivery compared to what's in the taxi industry. So those kinds of goals and the task force investigations really helped scope our pilot. We did quite a number of peer agency we looked at peer agency examples. Probably the largest is the Ride in Boston, MBTA. They partner with both Uber and Lyft, and they have since 2017. And it's fully system-wide and quite successful. DART in Dallas has the same. And Washington Metro just launched a partnership this spring. When we're looking at that traditional TNC partnership, we looked at those as well as others. And then because the industry is so notorious for not really having accessible fleet, and they've been really criticized and been lawsuits filed around that, we're very interested in looking at the program that Capital Metro has in Austin, Texas, which is Pickup. Basically, they put in a ride, an on-demand ride-hailing app. They partnered with Via and just installed it in their system. They wrapped their paratransit vehicles in branding for Pickup, and they offer the same on-demand ride-hailing service to their general public as well as their paratransit customers, and it's been successful as well. So that idea of creating your own on-demand fleet within as a subfleet of the whole was interesting too. And then locally, of course, we have Dakota County's agreement with Lyft that they've been helpful in partnering and giving us some information about their negotiations process with data sharing and other things that's been helpful in forming the scope of work here. But significantly, Metro Mobility customer outreach as well. For the last 3 biannual community forums, we've asked questions around this topic, really getting our customers who are at the table talking about their interest in it, their fears as it relates to it, their perception as it relates to the industry, what kind of gaps they see it could fill or not fill. And so we've taken some of that feedback. And again, some people really hate the idea, and certainly a good portion of our customer, probably the majority of our customer base, would not be a good fit for this kind of service. But certainly some are, and they've told us that. And so that's been important to us. So as far as the project itself, we have assembled a small cross-functional project team that includes staff from Metro Mobility Operations and Customer Services, Metro Transit Strategic Initiatives, planners and MTS, as well as outreach and communication staff to help us kind of, launch this out and create some visibility around it from the beginning. Some planning assumptions. It is a 12-month pilot period that were assumed and a 2-year option. So if it goes well, we could option it. That will give proposers maybe some investment in a contract with us and not just have it be a 12-month one-off. So we're building it with a 2-year option. A single, year 2 and year 3 are both options. We know that there will be a robust communication plan required. A lot of the criticism of our taxi service is that there's not an understanding necessarily of what to expect with the taxi industry as it compares to what they would get delivered with a Metro Mobility trip. And so there's always some need to build understanding and provide information and communication so people, if they do choose to book a ride on a Metro Mobility ride on a TNC, how is that different and what should they expect? So we'll build a communications plan around that. We don't know what to assume for ridership expectations, but we just basically took what we provide in a year with our taxi contract, assumed it would be probably at least that, maybe slow to adopt, maybe quick to adopt. You never know. It maybe depends on the public exposure around it. We assume a ride subsidy estimate similar to what we pay for our taxi contract, and we are also assuming that 25% of our ride requests may require a Lyft service because that is about the rate of Lyft vehicle or Lyft accessible rides that are required in our main system. So we have a scope of work that's in final stages of development. We have the kind of some basic requirements in the service model that I want to point out. We do want to make this available to all customers in the entire system, and so that's a requirement. I'm not necessarily interested in offering another on-demand or another option that has a high denial rate for people that need a wheelchair lift. We are requiring that there needs to be an accessible fleet with comparable wait times as part of the service. And because we don't know what the marketplace will bring to us, we're offering a couple options for proposal. One, that they could provide an accessible fleet themselves or subcontract it enough to meet the demand of our system, or they could provide the technology and partner with us on an app, an input or installation of their app into our own fleet. We have some spare fleet that could be used and then operated by a third-party contractor, our existing contractors. We assume a faring and subsidy and invoicing structure similar to our taxi contract. First $5 is the customer's obligation, the next 15 is the council's, and after that, it's whatever the ride would cost. And then we're also, though, at the same time, because technology is always improving, examining whether there's a potential to have the same council exposure of $15 per ride in the fare model, but we would pay the first $15 if we were able to validate that customer transferred to a fixed route system as a first mile, last mile option. So the exposure would be the same, but essentially if it's a short enough trip, the ride could be free. So there is some potential for that. We're looking at industry experience with that as well. I just got an email from RTD in Denver following up because they just recently launched a partnership with Uber where they're the first in the world to be able to offer their customers a transit ticket through the Uber app. And so I think there is an opportunity and maybe some willingness in these providers to modify their application to meet the market of public transit. So we're very interested in that, and so we're kind of building that ask into the RFP as well to ask for providers to be looking at that and helping us do that. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Questions for the presenter? Councilmember Gonzalez?
Hi, very interesting presentation, thank you. I was just wondering, especially since you mentioned that you've been in contact with cities like Denver and Dallas, I think you mentioned.
Yeah, and
large cities
DC.
That have a large non-English speaking population. So I'm imagining that might be part of their experience of how to integrate folks that do not speak English in how to access those services. Is that something that you requested from them information or that you have in mind? How to capture those folks?
Madam Chair, Council Member, that's an excellent question. I have not asked that specific question, but as we look at customer complaint data and that sort of thing and compare that not only in our pilot experience, but I can ask those questions of those agencies and see if they're discovering an issue or not. I would think it would tend to equalize things if a customer can manage their own booking in their app or they're having to call in for a reservation. That's a good thing, especially, and as well, the blind community being able to access through their own app and screen reader technology.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you, Chair. So questions related to the Metro Mobility Legislative Task Force established in 2017. One, were the appointees to that determined by the legislature or were they determined by the Met Council? And then a follow-up question to that is I'm interested to know if there were labor representatives either on that task force or on whatever other committees we're establishing here. And I guess where I'm going with this is that it's widely shared out that there's concerns about worker wages and benefits, specifically with the ride sharing entities and whether or not they're a house of cards. And I appreciate the effort to drive down or address the cost and efficiency issues, and at the same time would be concerned about us going down a path of potentially replacing a Met Council employee or worker-centered kind of service with a service where those folks weren't actually employed by the council.
Director Thompson, you want to address how
So the task force membership was dictated in the legislation about which entities would be part of it, and then, for example, the counties appointed a commissioner. They got to choose which of their commissioners, and then we had industry, nonprofits, council representation. So there's a variety of different members that were picked by the entities that were named in that. And the labor issues were discussed quite a bit in the task force. And in our last council, as we were considering this and the recommendations, is definitely one of the issues that I think we'll need to, you'll need as a council as these actions come forward to give us advice on, and we're not sure who's going to respond. I would just like to just clarify too that all our current Metro Mobility drivers are employees of the contractor, not the council, and so. Just to clarify that, so there wasn't any confusion. But it's it's an issue I think the peers have wrestled with too, kind of looking at what are they paying the drivers? Are the drivers making a good living wage in these salaries and not? And it's a concern that has been expressed to us.
Madam Chair, if I could add to that. And it's also important to note that of the contracted operators, contracted drivers in our system, not all are represented by labor. And the taxi industry, of course, is not. But yes, I was in many meetings where this was discussed in context of how that translates to service quality for the customer and the protections of safety, security, the background checks, and all of that. And so I didn't get into that detail to the nature of this presentation, but it's certainly part of the examination that we'll be doing over the course of the year, the pilot, and see what those impacts are.
Yeah, I think this was a lot of, it'd be interesting to go back and look at the report because there was a lot of discussion about just the relationships between us and the TNCs, and both from data sharing and from driver safety training and to wages and that type of thing. So there was a heartache discussion, and it was a very broad-ranging group who, if you put them in a room for most anything, you probably wouldn't get them all to agree, and they actually unanimously voted for the recommendations. So because we did a deep dive on a lot of things, and so it's really helpful reading, I think, and informs a lot of this discussion. So, but it's a great question to ask. So,
thank you.
Right. Any other questions? Not then, thank you. And that then concludes our business for this evening. So I'd entertain a motion.
Just one question. For the Sea Line launch, could we get the expenses that we did for that, and then what portion of those were spent with MCUB businesses?
I'm sure we can.
Sure, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, with that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor?